This is Patricia Thompson of New York City. Her love and admiration of Georgian culture is no accident. She often attends concerts of Georgian performers and sometimes goes backstage to speak with the fellow countrymen of her father, famous Russian poet Vladimir Mayakovsky.
Какой инструмент?
Пандуры.
Beautiful.
So how it sounds, Yelena Vladimirovna?
Beautiful. And a beautiful, handsome face.
So you didn't
Oh, these
think,
beautiful
no,
faces.
They will be here soon.
Ah, another beautiful girl. Oh, I'm supposed to dance now.
Yeah, with her she can show it.
I wish I could.
The birth of Patricia Thompson, or, as she calls herself, Yelena Vladimirovna, was kept secret until 1991, for more than 60 years. Now, for the first time, she presents herself to the dancers of the famous Georgian National Ballet Company, Saakashvili.
I love the height. Finally, women my height.
Wonderful. My father would be so glad that I'm here.
We know about your father many things.
Most people don't know about me.
Yeah. Yes, they does. We do.
Do you? Well, my father had Georgia in his heart.
Yes, I know.
He told my mother, and my mother told me. I'm really excited to be here. This is a wonderful, emotional, and artistic connection for me. There are not that many Georgian events. Немножко, да.
It all started in July 1925, when Mayakovsky was sent to New York for 3 months. Here he met Ellie Jones, or Elizabeth Siebert, an immigrant from Russia. She became his translator.
My mother told me that my father was absolutely irresistible. She told me that he was funny and great company to be with, not the serious face that he shows in many pictures. And the most important thing she told me was never to blame him. And I don't.
So how they met?
They met at a party in New York City given by a lawyer. My mother had been separated from her English husband, and she went to the party with her friend who was a model named Patricia Thompson. Of course, Mayakovsky didn't speak English, so he was quite enchanted that there was a young Russian girl. And she and Patricia went to Mayakovsky's apartment, and there she fell asleep. And in the morning, he said, "We have to go to Brooklyn Bridge." And so the group went to Brooklyn Bridge, and that's what inspired his poem, Brooklyn Bridge. That was the first day that they had been together. And my mother tells me they were inseparable after that. He was a one-woman man, one woman at a time.
Her house in northwest Manhattan looks like a medieval fortress. She lives alone and is 82 years old. She continues to write books, give lectures at the university, and to travel. Her day always begins with reading newspapers devoted to events in Russia and in Georgia.
So when first time you found out you are daughter of Vladimir Mayakovsky?
I don't remember the time when I first found out because I feel that I have always known. Before my mother died, I pretended on one occasion to be an interviewer like yourself, and I made a tape recording. I pretended I wasn't me, that I was interviewing her for the media. And I asked her a number of questions, and she answered them for me to formulate in my mind what had happened when she met Mayakovsky in New York. Based on that conversation with my mother, I kept those tapes, and after she passed away, I felt that the time was coming when I would have to disclose to the world that I was Mayakovsky's daughter. I always knew it, my mother always knew it, and my stepfathers always knew it. And one or two intimate friends of my family knew it. But everybody was very, very careful not to embarrass my mother or my stepfather, and not to embarrass me. So the decision was made. I made the decision based on my mother's values, is that perhaps is the right word, based on my mother's values, that before I did that, I would have to accomplish something on my own name. And that name was Patricia Thompson. My Russian name, of course, is Yelena Vladimirovna. But as Patricia Thompson, I became a full professor in a university. I published a number of other books, especially in education and for young people. And I was not interested in writing novels. I was interested in making social change, very much like Mayakovsky. I felt that writing should be put to a social purpose. And so the work that I had done had been scholarly. I believe in Russia it's called scientific. And little by little my interests moved from one discipline to another. And I wrote books for self-improvement for young people. And to my surprise, I found out later that Mayakovsky had done the same thing, that he had written a book about what shall I be. And many of my books had concluded with the very same idea. So it was a big surprise to me to learn that I had followed a path unknowingly that was similar to my father. Not a poet, but to promote social justice.
What happened next with the relationship between your mother and Mayakovsky?
She wasn't sure when he left that she might be pregnant. And one of the things that they had agreed was, about this, Proeta, we will be silent. And there were a lot of reasons for that. It was not shame, it was not embarrassment, it was the possibility of public disgrace for my mother, who was formally married to an English citizen. And she was not living with him at that time. Here in New York, people met with unexpected accidents. There was one friend of Mayakovsky's and my mother who was a director of Amtorg, Isaiah Kurgin. And he met with a very strange accident that my mother told me about. He was drowned in a lake in upstate New York, and people said the water was only 3 feet deep. And that seemed to happen to a lot of people at that time. So my mother was very afraid that if anyone learned that we were so close to Mayakovsky, that we would have an unfortunate fate. When the time came for Mayakovsky to leave, they spent the last night together, and she did not want to go to the ship with him, but when she came back to her apartment, she found her bed covered with violets, that he had spent his last money on flowers, and they were all sprinkled all over her bed. And that was the sort of relationship they had. It was romantic, it was brief, and it was tragic, because they could not, under any circumstances, at those times, make a life together. My grandfather had been exiled from Russia.
Siebert's family came to Russia from Germany. Why?
Oh, the original family, the Siebert family and the Neufeld family, my grandmother's family, had been invited by Catherine the Great to come to Russia to help Russia develop business and to help Russia develop its resources, because they had a good reputation for hard work and for honesty. They were Christians, and so they were honest. And so there was already many generations. My mother's father was a very successful businessman, landowner, and he had educated his family very well. My mother spoke 4 languages. Russian was her first language. She spoke German, French, and English. And so when she met Mayakovsky, she was able to translate Rilke and Goethe, and they had wonderful conversations, she told me. And there was both intellectual and physical attraction. And I'm very fortunate because I have both physical and intellectual qualities of both my parents.
During his stay in New York, Mayakovsky lived in the Bronx with his closest friend, David Berluk, a famous Russian artist.
And Mayakovsky took my mother to visit Berluk in the Bronx. And the picture that is most often used in Russian publications of Ellie Jones sitting on the roof of an apartment building, that was on the roof of Berluk's apartment building. But the important thing was that Berluk's wife was born in Ufa. So both my mother and Mrs. Berluk came from Bashkiria. So they had a lot in common. At the time, Berluk had 2 little boys, and Mayakovsky was charmed with his children. Berluk did a lovely, lovely sketch of my mother. It's a beautiful portrait.
Tell me about your meeting with Tatiana Leszczenko-Suchamlinskaya. You try to find people who saw Mayakovsky and your mother together.
Yes. If I remember correctly, her American married name was Pepper. And it was arranged for me to meet her, and she was very gracious to me. And she remembered very clearly that she had seen my mother and my father in New York. And she said there were 2 people, but there was a 3rd presence, and it was Lyubov, love.
The family of Vladimir Talmy hosted Mayakovsky during his visit to New York City in 1925. In 1925, Mayakovsky was invited to our home by my parents. We have a photo where on the back my mother wrote that it had been taken by Mayakovsky when they were sitting next to my stroller. Mayakovsky was accompanied by a woman, Ellie Jones. My mother knew her. Later, she gave birth to Mayakovsky's daughter here in America. My mother remembered how Mayakovsky took me in his arms and said loudly, "Hey, Vovka, Vovka, why are you not my namesake, Vladimir Vladimirovich?"
It is known that Mayakovsky spoke Georgian fluently. Did your mother ever mention that?
One touching thing that my mother told me about his loyalty to his Georgian origins was that when he stood on a street corner in New York, he would throw his arms out and begin to bellow in Georgian, and all the taxi drivers, who apparently at that time were Georgian, would come around to listen to him and see what he had to say, and he was very happy. There were no Georgian restaurants at that time in New York that they knew of, so they used to go to Armenian restaurants, and for that reason, I also have a deep affection for Armenians. But as far as Georgia, the temperament that Mayakovsky had certainly was influenced by growing up in Georgia. And I think he used to beat himself on the chest and say, "I am a Georgian born." Pa-Angliski, that's English, of course. But I understand that because he was independent, he was forthright, he was not a liar, he was very honest, and he was also very gentle. And it seems to me that he had the qualities that I have observed in some lovely Georgian people.
You little bit are upset that Mayakovsky again named Baghdadi, right?
Oh yes, I felt sorrowful. I thought it was such a wonderful tribute to name the town for Mayakovsky. And I think that I felt it was almost disloyal, because I know that he was never disloyal to Georgia. Emotionally, I think he was always very tied to his Georgian origins, and his personality certainly was very Georgian.
You also feel some Georgian...
Yes, I do. I do. When I think about how independent I am and how straightforward I am, I don't lie, I don't cheat. Now, I realize that there are always failures in any society, but I think that the Georgian character at its best is one of integrity and of great intellect and promise.
You want to go to Georgia?
I would love to go to Georgia. I had one invitation, but unfortunately it came at a time that I already had my plans to return to America. I was in Russia at the time, and I wanted so much to go, but it wasn't possible to arrange it. And then I never heard from the people again.
But you went to Bashkiria, where your mother is from.
Oh, that was arranged for me by a wonderful sociologist. Dr. Sharageva was instrumental in arranging a visit for me to Ufa, and then from Ufa to Davlekanova, which is the hometown of my mother. And the thing that was so astonishing is that my grandfather's house was still standing. And it was amazing to me to look at the pictures from my mother's childhood and to see the house, and I could recognize the porch where she had stood with her cousins and her classmates in school. And I was able to go through the house. They showed me the floor plan, and they were able to tell me that a table in the kitchen had belonged to my grandmother, and then they showed me the room where my aunts had been little babies in cribs, and I could see why my mother and my aunts were so homesick, always homesick for Davlekanova, for Bashkortostan, for Russia. And I cried. I put my hands on the wood, and I knew that my grandfather had lived there and had built this for his family. I know that they were a happy family there until the revolution, and that they worked hard to provide for their families. And my grandfather was very well-to-do. The family mythology is that my grandfather lent the Tsar 1,000,000 rubles. There was a young man who played, is it the guitar? That is a beautiful sound. I was so carried away by that sound. It sounds like nightingales. And my grandmother wrote a poem about how she missed the Urals and how she missed the nightingales. And nightingales have a very clear symbolic meaning to me, because when I read Mayakovsky's book, How Are Verses Made? That was the question my mother asked him, how are verses made? When she first met him, she said, how are verses made? Later he wrote a book called How Are Verses Made? And I read that book, and one of the things that Mayakovsky said is that his poetry was like a broth of nightingales. I said, why don't people pay attention to him? Why? Почему? Why aren't they listening to him? He told them how he works. And then instead they say, well, this woman inspired that, or that woman inspired that. It's not true. He was much greater artist than that. One woman would inspire one part of his very complex personality, and another woman, or another man, or another experience would bring something else out in him. And the time would come when he would bring these all together in nightingale broth. Now, I said something to my Russian friend Nikolai Morev one time. I said, well, I am creating nightingale borscht. And he didn't like that. He thought that that was a desecration to my father's ideas. But I do. I create nightingale borscht. My father made the broth, and I make the borscht. So anything that I do in my writing and in my creativity is an idea from here, an idea from there, and then I try to create a completely different complex of ideas. And so my father has inspired me not because of his poetry, which I love best, of course, a block of Stanak. And people tease me when I say that I'm a thundercloud in a skirt, but I am. Nobody can mess with me.
Do you have any of Mayakovsky's personal belongings?
When he was in New York, there were occasions that he became very emotional, and he would draw what we today would call a cartoon. One of them was after he and my mother had had a difference of opinion, and my mother was ready to move on without him. And he apologized, and he drew a picture of my mother shooting what we call in English, shooting daggers at him from her eyes, and his head is bowed, and the English word is contrite. That means that he was very apologetic for what he had said, and he wanted their relationship to continue. And the other one is when he's standing in front of his beloved's apartment building on 71st Street, and his arms are out, and all of these, and the little oligarchs, and he's keeping them away in their automobiles from wooing or pursuing my mother. And she was only in her early 20s when Mayakovsky met her, and she was a model, and she was very beautiful. All of the Russian girls at that time had never had enough to eat, so they were all slender and beautiful, and they were very much admired, all of them, my mother and others, by American cosmeticians, and they were hired sometimes by Elizabeth Arden and other people in the cosmetics industry to promote their products, the early days of that industry.
What do you have here?
These are the archives from 1991 up until a year ago. I have altogether 30 volumes of archives, and they cover my career and my, what I call my parallel life, my life as Patricia Thompson, and my life as Yelena Vladimirovna Mayakovskaya. And I think they may be of interest to scholars at some future time when I'm not here to explain it to them. It begins with some of my mother's manuscripts, and of course the same famous picture by Berliuk is on the cover. And then it contains all of these handwritten mementos of my mother. Some of them are typed, but it also has a copy of the famous, what I call the two Ellies letter. Speaks about how much Mayakovsky wants to come and see us.
My dear two lovely Ellies, I already miss you and hope to see you in less than a week. Will you accept me? Will you treat me kindly? I regret that I haven't been able to keep myself in as good shape as you may have wished. I hope to remedy this in Nice and appear to you in all my splendor. I kiss all your 8 paws. Your Vol.
And that letter was written in Nice. When I met my father in France, when I was almost 3 years old, I had been playing with some of his papers, my mother told me, and she had slapped my hand. And Mayakovsky said, "Never slap a child." And he called my mother Bolshoye Eli and me Malenkaya Eli, because my Russian name is Elena, and that was for my godmother, Princess Sviatopolmirsky, and my grandmother was also a Helen.
You speak Russian, do you remember?
I used to speak Russian, but my mother gradually moved away from the Russian community, and I wasn't surrounded by Russian people. So although I spoke Russian when I met Mayakovsky, I also spoke German, French. I didn't speak English till I was 5.
Do you remember something? Can you say Russian something?
Я вас люблю.
What else?
Я хочу кушать. Я хочу спать. Я скучно.
You have his picture, you have his sculpture. Do you talk to him sometimes?
Sometimes.
You always watch him, I know this.
Sometimes. Yes. When I pass his picture, I say, "How do you like that, Papa?"
And he sometimes sent help mother financially
No.
because they have in a notebook some bank accounts.
He was never able to help my mother financially. That's one of the cruelties of the times, because things were very difficult financially for my mother. She worked as a maid for a very rich American society woman who didn't treat her very well. And I've always been very angry that my mother would have to suffer that way. Not to suffer for being a maid, but to suffer for being badly treated. I would never treat anyone the way my mother had been treated, to humiliate and embarrass her and act as if someone is better than anyone else. That's not my way of doing things. So I've always felt very badly that my biological father could not help to support us But my mother's husband did the best that he could. America was in a depression, and it seems sad that my biological father, my quote, real father, was prohibited from helping us. I think he did it to be sure that we were not identified and maybe would have befallen a bad fate.
Did your mother correspond with him?
I feel that there was some interruption of correspondence between my mother and my father that was caused by third parties, not by my father's indifference or my mother's lack of concern, but she tried to correspond with him, and I believe that some of the correspondence was diverted, that he didn't receive it. He was surprised at some of the things my mother told him. And he told her some very interesting things about the associations of people who were close to him, to the NKVD.
Do you mean Lilia Brick?
I'm afraid it would have been Lily Brick, yes. And certainly it came out later that she was very well connected to the secret police. And I think it was something that will have to be discovered by historians and put into perspective. There were many things that Lila Brick did that were very kind and very promoting of my father and his work, but more importantly, her husband, Ossip Brick, the literary critic, was more like a father figure to my father, I believe. People don't understand what it was like for my father to lose his father as a teenager and to be imprisoned in solitary confinement when he was a teenager. I think those things had a profound effect on his personality, maybe influenced his art, but certainly his social commitment to the revolution and to the hope for a better future for Russia are absolutely unparalleled. I believe that my father was a martyr for Russia, that he died for Russia, not for some romance.
What did you feel when you visited Russia for the first time?
I got down on my knees and I kissed the ground.
What you felt?
I did that because I was home. It was the first time that I was home. That's my home. I've always felt very bitter that I could not have grown up in Russia, even in hard times. I went to Novodevichy, first of all, to honor my father, my grandmother, and my aunts. The entire Mayakovsky family, if I understand correctly, is buried in Novodevichy. But I had another personal reason for going. I took my mother's ashes and I parted the soil on my father's grave, and I put some of my mother's ashes to return her to the great love of her life. The first love of her life was Russia. The second love of her life was Mayakovsky.
I know you want to be citizen of Russia, and you have some plan.
I would be so proud to have a Russian passport. I feel, now I feel like crying because, of course, my father's wonderful poem about his Soviet passport, I understand the feeling that he had to identify himself with such a great social experiment. Tragedy is, of course, that it wasn't as successful as he would have hoped it would be. But my heart has always been with Russia. I'm proud to have American identity, but I am emotionally and psychologically Russian. And it's my hope that before I die, that I will be granted a Russian passport in honor of my father. That's the important thing. How can you not walk among the Russian people and love them? I walk through the streets of Moscow or Ufa or the small town where my mother lived, Davlekanova in Bashkortostan. There has not been one Russian person that I have met that my heart doesn't go out to, and I wish them well.
You went to some museum here.
Yes, I went to the Mayakovsky Museum, and I was certainly very touched at the collection of materials. She showed me one of my father's notebooks. I believe it's notebook number 60. And there's one page, and the only word on it is Dochka. So that's his love letter to me.
And you also saw Veronika Polonskaya, Mayakovsky's beloved. What did you think about her?
First of all, she was beautiful. She was caring. I can see why my father would have liked her. As an old lady, she was still a very remarkable woman. And one of the things that I asked Madame Polonskaya was, why in my father's death note did he mention you and not my mother or me as his family? Oh, she said, he did it, she said, and she pointed to herself, she said, it did it to protect me and to protect you. Then I understood. Of course he couldn't identify us in his death note. And the death note anyhow is very suspicious. It was probably written 2 or 3 days before his untimely death. I will never say that he committed suicide. Someone will have to prove to me that he truly committed suicide. I don't believe it. And I think there are others who don't believe it either. She gave me a little statue of Mayakovsky with a cigarette in his mouth. And another thing she told me is that my father always carried a pen that I had given him. He had a great fondness for different pens, and my mother had given me a pen to give to him. And Madame Polonskaya told me that he kept it with him over his heart. So those are the things that tell me for sure that he and I have a true understanding. I am his daughter, he was my father.
You are daughter of Mayakovsky. How do you feel?
Well, I only have to look in the mirror. From the time I was growing up, it was very clear I was his daughter. I think sometimes daughters favor their fathers, not just myself, but other daughters as well. And for that reason, intellectually, I'm very interested in the Y chromosome and the X chromosome. The X chromosome from one's father, of course, is what makes one a girl. I often wonder if I'd had a Y chromosome and been a boy, whether people would have taken me more seriously. But it's because I have 2 X chromosomes, and one of them comes from my father, that I feel that I have certain qualities. And as I grew up, I used to draw, I danced, I was interested in theater. I feel that people say that Mayakovsky had a talent for each one of his 10 fingers. Well, maybe I had a talent for each of 5 fingers. And I find that I went to art school, at the same age that he went to art school when I was 17. And I might have been an artist, but I couldn't make a living at it. So I had to find another career. Then I majored in political science and pre-law. And then I was admitted to the graduate faculties of Columbia University to study international law. And then I got a job in the publishing industry, and I was an editor for 2 major publishers. I went on to a publishing company where I edited books in that field, and then I became an author.
The experience Patricia Thompson received in the publishing business helped her create her books. One of them is titled Mayakovsky on Manhattan. It is the story of her parents' romantic relationship.
Would you like your book to be the basis of future movie?
I would like to see my book, Mayakovsky in Manhattan, translated into a ballet. I think it's a very tender, very emotional story, and it allows wonderful opportunity for musical interpretation and for a ballet interpretation.
About your love, about your... Who was your inspiration?
In what?
In life.
My father.
No, but another man? You didn't have another man? You loved...
I had a lot of boyfriends when I was in college, and it was a changing time for young women. It was very important to be independent. I had my own apartment. I gave a lot of great parties. I matched up a lot of my friends. I had boyfriends from all kinds. I never had a Russian boyfriend, by the way. Never had a Russian boyfriend. Well, I couldn't tell them anything about myself. And most of the Russians that I met thought I was just an American, so they weren't interested in me. But I had a very good Russian girlfriend named Galina Tsvetkova. who went to the same high school I did, and very talented actress. And she later married a Russian journalist. Unfortunately, she died of cancer. But she was my closest American-Russian girlfriend.
Who was your husband?
I didn't meet my husband until I had already had a career for several years in publishing, and I had an interest in academic things. And I met my husband on a weekend that I went away with a friend of mine to Atlantic City, and he was a tenor and a vocalist with an ice show. He was handsome, he was funny, he was just a delightful person. My other boyfriends were all lawyers or wanted to be doctors and had professional ambitions, and my husband was sort of the black sheep of his family. I thought he was charming. I fell in love with him. We married fairly soon after we met each other, and our son was born 9 months and 2 weeks after we got married. And then he stayed in show business, and I continued my academic and other pursuits. And we were married for 25 or 30 years. He came from a very good American family. He was a descendant of a signer of the Declaration of Independence, and my son is named for a signer of the Declaration of Independence. His name is Roger Sherman from Connecticut. So I married a man who had a very good bloodlines, and I thought, okay, my children will be the children of two revolutions, the Russian Revolution and the American Revolution. He wanted to live in California, and I wanted to stay in New York with my academic career. We got a divorce, and we stayed friends. I always wanted my son to have a good relationship with his father, because his father was charming and agreeable and a very nice man. Hello.
Hello.
This is my son. This is Mayakovsky's grandson. He came to put a cartridge in my computer, and I had some other thing.
Here you go.
Roger Sherman Thompson is an intellectual property lawyer and is married. They wanted to adopt a child in Russia, but didn't due to bureaucratic delays. He is now raising a son named Logan from Colombia.
I love you.
I love you too, Mother.
Have you been in Russia, Roger?
2 or 3 times, I think.
Really?
Yes.
So you liked it?
I liked it very much. People were wonderful. They were very kind and gracious towards me, and more importantly, towards my mother. And it was very gratifying to me to see that they still remember my grandfather and how much he seems to mean to people on a personal level, even in their daily lives. It was very rewarding to me to get that feeling that he was remembered and considered to be important and precious to them. And that was very moving to me.
My beautiful son, who is one of the kindest, sweetest men in the world, and he has a professional interest. He doesn't remind me in any way of Mayakovsky temperamentally, but his interest is in intellectual property. And he came with me to Russia in the early years, and he wanted to talk to Russians about protecting their intellectual property. I think that is very important.
Very important.
And I think that Russians have to understand that copyright and trademark and patents are as important as oil and gas.
Your hobby. Do you have hobby?
Thinking. Thinking is my hobby. When I was younger, ice skating was my hobby. My stepfather was an ice skating instructor, so I spent a lot of time at the ice skating rink at Rockefeller Center. But I love to watch the Russian skaters. I think the Russian skating is just classical, beautiful. Now I'm a full professor at Lehman College, which is part of the City University of New York. I teach in the Liberal Arts College, and my discipline is now women's studies and education. There was a period in Greek history when there was a special veneration of the fireplace and the hearth, and the protector of the household and the family was called Estia. And I have done my research on Estia and on her nephew Hermes. And I have come to the conclusion that we don't live in a single system of action, that we live in two separate systems of action. The first one is our rodny, our family, our kinship group. And the second one is our citizenship and our public persona as members of a polis or a political society. And through men's eyes, the political society has always been primary in research and in theory. But in my work, the family and kinship is always primary. And because they are unique and independent, I have developed something I call the dual systems theory, so that we have to understand both the nation, the state and the government as one system, but we also have to understand the household, the family, and the home as another system. Because actually, Mayakovsky had a real interest in the household, family, and home, but he never lived to enjoy it. But I want to.
Yelena Vladimirovna remains vigorous and continues to possess a tenacious memory and optimism. Her constant companions are boundless enthusiasm, love of life, and a sense of humor. Her philosophical credo leads us to believe that she will continue a long path of happiness and joy for the rest of her days.